May the words of my mouth and the meditation of our hearts be acceptable in your sight, O Lord, our strength and our Redeemer.
Amen.
I remember one Lent when I was rector in Detroit, and our congregation, St. Matthew's and St. Joseph's, partnered with a suburban parish for our Lenten series and for Holy Week. And it was an interesting pairing because both parishes were led by women. My congregation, though, was predominantly Black, African American, Caribbean, and African, and the other congregation was predominantly white. My church was an historic parish, at the time over 160 years old. And it was the result of a merger of two congregations. St. Matthew's was the Black church, and the really old church, actually both of them were very old, and St. Joseph's was the white congregation. And after a few short years of that merger, many of the white members left, and they ended up being members of that suburban congregation that was there with us that Lent. And as I was giving a tour of the building, one of the members from the suburban congregation asked me, "What is that hanging on the wall?" And I thought, this must be a trick question. But I answered, "That's a crucifix. Did I understand your question?" Well, he quite proudly went on to explain to me that they didn't have any crucifixes at their church because Jesus is risen from the dead already, he told me. We don't need to see him dead on a cross anymore. Talking about it later, members and I expressed our shock and unsettled feeling that someone would be so uncomfortable and not want to see Jesus on a cross. And I went on to explain to the man that we do know that Jesus is raised from the dead, but we couldn't have a resurrected Savior if he hadn't first died, and he died on a cross. That evening also included a recounting of the history of our church, which had been established during slavery time. And the founding lay member, William Lambert, was an abolitionist and led the congregation in supporting the Underground Railroad, assisting thousands of people to escape slavery. And then during the Civil Rights era, they provided for the educational needs of young people at a high school just up the street from them in Detroit, who were being denied decent schools and a decent education. And then during my time, the congregation had an extensive ministry serving meals, running a pantry that served thousands, and helping formerly incarcerated individuals to become stable and suitable workers. This church had been founded and continued in a ministry intimately acquainted with what it meant to deal with hardship and what it meant to work for justice. It was clear that this congregation was undoubtedly in touch with the fact that a Jesus that suffered on the cross might know something about the difficulties and the trials of their lives. A God who is acquainted with suffering is a God worth following. And our gospel says, Jesus called the crowd with his disciples and said to them, "If any want to become my followers, let them deny themselves and take up their cross and follow me. For those who want to save their life will lose it, and those who lose their life for my sake and for the sake of the gospel, save it." What did Jesus mean by, "If any want to become my followers, take up your cross and follow me"? I bet the disciples could not believe their ears. I can hear them asking each other, "Didn't Jesus come to make life better, not put our lives at risk? Is this a trick invitation?" Well, Jesus was born into a family living under occupation. And I can't imagine what it must have been like for him growing up with the gruesome sight of crucified bodies in the countryside. Crosses with people crucified on them were as common as driving down the freeway and seeing billboards. During his time in the wilderness, Jesus had to make choices about the way that he would live his life. He did not choose the way of the world. He did not choose to use his power to coerce people to do his will. Jesus spent his ministry looking after the outcasts in a community of oppressed people. He could heal and feed the people, but they also needed freedom. He taught them that they would never be free if they adopted the way of their oppressors. Jesus' way on earth could not be an affirmation of the powers that kept his people from living free lives. And Jesus certainly was not at all what his community expected from the Messiah. Many people thought that the Messiah would come using the same type of force that their oppressors used. How can a Messiah be on a cross? And how can a Messiah ask those who follow him to join him in taking up the cross? The crowd and the disciples knew full well what a cross looked like and the types of activities that would get a person crucified. People didn't end up on a cross for being someone who went along with the status quo. A cross was not for someone who was willing to accept the way society was. People ended up on a cross mostly because they stood up to their oppressors and said no to injustice in their words and in their deeds. The cross was a weapon of control used by the Romans to keep people quiet and to keep them in their places, to make them too afraid to stand up for what was right. So when Jesus made the invitation to take up the cross, the disciples and the people were not confused about what he meant. They knew that he was calling them to risk their lives for the sake of justice. They didn't want to hear it, but they also weren't trying to reinterpret his straightforward statement to make it more palatable or convenient or less threatening. What does Jesus mean by, if any want to become my followers, take up your cross and follow me? How have we interpreted his invitation? Well, generally speaking, Western society has not fully embraced Jesus of the cross. We are much more comfortable with the miracle-working Jesus. Making water into wine, walking on water, healing and feeding Jesus is our preference. But that is not a resurrected Jesus. If we don't become intimately connected to Jesus on the cross, we will not be able to be faithful to his call to us, to take up our cross and follow him. Taking up our cross is a matter of discipleship, committing to a life of growing one's faith through prayer, worship, study, giving, community, serving, and action. Through the ages, people have continued to seek a comfortable gospel instead of a gospel that calls forth disciples like Peter, disciples who consistently wrestle with going to the places that true discipleship will lead you. In every age, we are called to a faithful interpretation of just what it means to take up Jesus' cross. It has meant different things at different times, but it has always meant having the concern of the vulnerable as a primary focus of the life and ministry of the community of faith, and for each of us as disciples of Jesus Christ. We have bound our hearts in allegiance to the God of the oppressed. So, how are you called to take up your cross today? What ways are you being called to take a risk on behalf of and in solidarity with others?